But the catch is, when the central bank version, why are they doing this? It's so they can impose negative interest rates. This is for next time round. How will they do it? Well, because they can then set a rate of exchange between the digital money and real money. So you give them $100, they give you 97 back. That I've chosen that number specifically because that was the IMF International Monetary Fund example, which I believe they're using as a template. So that would set an interest rate of -3% a year, which would be quite punishing if you look at it like that. This is the reverse example. I'm sure you have a similar system in some form in the US, but in the UK, when someone puts money in a pension, i.e. they're going to say they're going to pay in their own money, then they get given an illustration. Now, the illustration, because I worked in this area for a while, it'd be something like 2% a year, 4% a year, 6% a year. So you end up with more money than you started, hopefully. Now try doing that with -3% a year. Their theory is that as a collective, there's too much savings in the world.
Welcome to the RTD interview. Today, I'm excited to have first-time guest, Mr. Shaun Richards. He's an independent economist that specializes in inflation measurements as well as monetary economics. And today, he's joining us to share his thoughts on the global economy as well as particular strategies that we, the investors, might be able to use in the days ahead. So, Shaun Richards, thank you for joining us on RTD interviews.
Thank you for the invite.
Well, I appreciate you taking time to join me. Looking forward to connecting. It's been a while since we've last spoken, but looking forward to it nevertheless. And so before we dive any further, can you give the viewers a little bit of your background and how you've arrived at this point in your career?
Sure, no problem. I began some years ago in the bond markets, but when there were such things as stockbrokers in London. That was when I came out of university. And then the starting point was a thing that in the UK is the opposite of what we now call QE. The UK was doing the reverse. And then in the subsequent years, rather scarily, it's about 30 now, has been a pattern of looking at the developments and changes that we've seen. I worked in Tokyo for a while, so that gave an international perspective. I look at Japan, and Japan was a leader into many of the things we face now. Zero interest rates, central bank intervening in so many places. What other things have happened over that period? Moving away from just me, that's been one of the things. Interest rates are so much lower. Believe it or not, I've seen bond yields of 15%. I don't think they got quite that high in the US, but they did get into double figures, and they certainly did in the UK. And then the switch, the newer thing, was the credit crunch that brought lots of things back. But as I was explaining earlier, was pretty much a doppelganger or the opposite of what we saw before. And now, of course, we've had the pandemic as well, and it's 2021.
Here we are, 2021, a year like no other. Thank you for sharing that with us. And so I'm curious to get your thoughts, and I'd like to start off with the very first question because the show is called Rethinking the Dollar, and it's a subject matter I think is very relevant given the fact I think we're in this great reset, structured reset to where the dollar will no longer be the world's favorite reserve asset in the near future or far future, we'll see. But what comes to mind when you hear the words rethinking the dollar?
Well, there's two things really. The first is from a UK perspective, something that maybe Americans don't think about so much. But for us, it's a big deal because movements in the pound against the dollar affect inflation, the price of things. I don't know, probably the generic example is the price of oil, but there are many others. Because for us, things are priced in dollars. And we have to take our pounds and go and buy them. And the exchange rate matters a lot more than it, just for like holiday. It matters for real things. And next is something that you sort of led into, because in some respects, in terms of reserves, the pound is used, but on a much, much smaller scale compared to the US dollar. And when I look around at various countries, it starts, well, you start with Ukraine, go to the other end of the alphabet to Argentina. These places a lot use the US dollar. Why? Because it's known. That's a sort of practical example of the theory of it being the reserve currency. As you're anywhere where you might be in the world, if you've got a handful of US dollars or a debit card that could spend US dollars, it has value. People will understand it, be you in the jungle, the desert. And that's what it means.
Understandable. Thank you for sharing that. Now, I want to jump right into some relevant topics because you're a prolific writer, and so I'll definitely link your blog down below. That's how I stay in tune with what you have going on. And so recently, you wrote your latest piece on the the bond yields heading low or lower rather globally. And so, if you don't mind, can you share and elaborate a little bit on that for us? Because clearly, we've all witnessed over the last several years the bond bubble, where yields are trending down or towards a negative in some places. But share with us a little bit your thoughts and analysis from that blog post there.
Well, you see, there's been quite a bit going on. If we just stay with this year, we opened 2021 with yields rising. Now, in terms of conventional explanations or theory, that worked quite well. Why? Well, economies were picking up, so people might want a higher yield. Inflation was expected to go higher. Transitory, as the Fed calls it. But anyway, again, bond yields higher. So things were in tune, if you like. And then roughly the US 10-year went up to about 1.8% at the peak. Now, that's not actually very much, but in 2021 terms, or in the last year or so it is. Whereas now, today, they've gone below 1.3%. So we've seen a shift the other way, except the two narratives that look like they were working haven't, because inflation has turned up, and depending on your measures, been quite high. We've seen the CPI in the US go over 5%. So how's the bond yield 1.3? That doesn't really work. And also the economy's picked up as well. Now, people who disagree as to the exact rates and what's going to happen next, but in general, the recovery's been pretty good. So the narrative has collapsed. It had two legs and they've both gone. And so that's the pattern. And this is part of the sort of confusion of our times. People love to attach explanations to something, but then it turns out that they don't work. And part of the way I look at things is to try and understand that and move on, not just to run away around the corner and then talk and, shout about something else. Because big things are in play. What do I mean by that? If I look back now, 2020, years before, what we've seen is a long trend to lower yields and interest rates. Lower mortgage rates is a nice thing for the ordinary person, but on the other side of the coin, for the saver, it isn't. For someone that has a pension and some form of annuity, they're not getting very much for it. So there's two sides to the coin. And that leads us to why that really matters. Central banks have moved interest rates to more or less zero. One of the ironies of the current situation is, and I'm not sure how far out it's got to the wider world, the Federal Reserve is trying to stop US rates going negative. Things have sort of flipped over onto the other side. And so they're trapped there, not wanting to go lower. So they only have bond yields and that sort of thing left. Now, as to whether that's played out in exactly the same formula in the US, because I know your system's different. But for example, in the UK in recent years, many more mortgages are fixed rate. So it started with more new ones going that way. And then there's now been so many new ones that the stock is now mostly fixed rate as well. So the whole system's changed. If the Bank of England did go out and change bank rate tomorrow, then it would go around the media and things like that. And people would say it's a big deal. But in many places now it's not. Because if you've got a 5-year mortgage, you don't care. Mm-hmm. And so that's been the changes and switches that we've seen.
Yeah. Now, with the long-term trajectory of yields heading to zero, ZERP, NERP, all those newer terms to myself, and as well as to the world, I'm sure no one will ever imagine that we'll be this low as far as actual yields on the government bonds. But yet, in your opinion, is there real nominal terms? Can we go below zero? Can the government literally, I think a lot of nations in the EU are already issuing negative coupon bonds or whatnot. Is that something that the US can do as a reserve currency, you think?
Yes, but however, it's slightly careful. I think there was, when this all started 10 years ago, I remember people claiming that legally the Fed couldn't. Well, some things have got a little bit merged in the US, for example. Now, I know this is not the Federal Reserve, but some US Treasury bills this year have been at negative yields. So that means that negative interest rates are possible because we've found over the last 10 years, let's say a central bank has a rule that stops it from doing something, well, they just change it. That's been the famous situation from the European Central Bank, that's consistently done that, all sorts of things that people thought were not possible reading the rules have turned up, and it's doing them right now, as you say. Germany, 10-year yield minus 0.3%. This has been the situation at that maturity for what? I think the last 3 years, at others, maybe the last 5, that Germany is paid to borrow. Switzerland, ditto. Netherlands, similar. And that filters out around Europe, depending on how close you're considered to be at the centre. But this can happen, has happened. You were kind enough to ask about my history in the past. I'll lob in something else now. I worked on the futures exchange in London. It was called Life. And I was in the options pit that specialised in interest rates. And about 15, 20 years ago, no, more than that, excuse me, a bit over 20 years ago, we had a discussion. Could interest rates go negative? And we concluded no. Shows what we knew, doesn't it? Why? Because in the situation then, maybe we were right. Well, actually, we were right because it didn't. But the situation now, plainly, we're wrong. And that has been the thing that presses here. And what the US faces, the US has differences, as I explained a little bit earlier, like, for example, the role of the dollar is different to elsewhere, and something structurally in the economy. Through this phase, your growth rates tended to be better. So that's a strength for the US compared to the sort of peers of Europe, Japan, UK, and so on. So that, again, is a strength. However, the problems are the same, that the plates are spinning, and one of the answers keeps being lower interest rates. The trouble is when you do that, more debt builds up. Now, right now, the example of that would be debt of the US Treasury, deficit and debt building up. But then you can't afford higher interest rates later, can you? Because you can't pay for them. You know, so it's like the lyric from Suspicious Minds, Elvis Presley, I use it a bit, you know, we're caught in a trap. And I forget the next bit, you can't get out. But then the next line is because I love you too much, baby. And that's the thing in the situation that we keep spinning. Europe's the most extreme case, as we see it. Why? Because the euro area struggled for growth. And that's been the thing that has been, and this is obviously because there's lots of different countries in there with different circumstances. But as a generic, they've struggled. If you look even at the heart of Germany, that's not done so well. And there are other places like Greece that's done dreadfully. Italy, that's always been a struggle. France, not so well either. And so these are the things that are in play. If you look across the Pacific from your angle and look at Japan, this has been something since I worked out there, which is more than 20 years ago, that things as a collective have in essence gone nowhere. And you can take this across several metrics: growth for the whole country, inflation pretty much true, actually, and virtually not been any. And so bringing this all back to the US, the same problems have to apply. Otherwise, you wouldn't have ended up back at zero again, would you? Now, I know literally it's 0.1, but as roughly zero interest rates. And so, yes, can happen. Probably will, because next recession, what else are they going to do?
It's very true. The next recession, what will they do? And so, from you share that information there, a lot of buzzwords jumped out. And so, in government's quest to create growth, they literally have to expand the debt to meet current obligations. And so, I assume there's a lot of talk about increased taxation. So, the higher the debt, the more taxes they'll try to bring in to help service that. So, we have the global corporate tax. 130 nations are looking to, are agreeing upon that. And of course, I have my, opinions about that. But also here in the U.S. and beyond, they're talking about tax reform now. They're trying to, get more tax from the uber wealthy. But ultimately, we all know it trickles down to the working class, those that actually work and actually truly pay income taxes. So what are your thoughts on that? Will they be able to keep this facade going for much longer, trying to provide growth through debt, monetization or whatnot? And will they be able to kind of bring things in and keep things afloat with increased taxation, you think?
Well, one of the problems with the tax line of argument is that in general, countries have struggled raising taxes. If we look at Japan, this has been its first move was in 2014 in terms of raising the consumption tax, what we over here would call VAT. What you in the States, I guess, is a form of sales tax, excise duty, that sort of thing lumped in. That they've had 2 goes in 6 years it's taken them. In the UK, there was a thing to reform national insurance for the self-employed. Now, it's not called that. It's a type of income tax here. They tried to raise it for the self-employed, and then the government went into full retreat. So this theme that it's quite difficult to raise taxes is a problem. I know that it's part of the Biden plan in the US. But say, for example, coming back to the UK again, the idea of raising the basic rate of tax, I can remember that in my career in the UK, that people would seek to be elected on that, and then governments would do it. We haven't seen that for ages. It's almost not even mentioned anymore. So the tax thing, I think, is an issue. So the global thing of whether they can apply that is going to be difficult, because you get those that, I mean, the classic case in between us in geographical terms is Ireland. That's basically run its economy on running a cheap tax rate and being part of the Euro system. And Dublin's done very well out of that as a financial centre, and other bits like aircraft leasing. Can they get places like that to join in? That's the tax issue. Coming back to the debt side, I was thinking when I was explaining before, more in the lines of the fact of what governments have to pay each year on the debt. Because obviously the debt pile is higher. A 1% rise in interest rates is a lot more expensive. Or this can come in another form, not often well considered, but I know the US has inflation-linked securities like the UK. But actually in the UK, it's about 1/5 of the market. So rises in inflation are dangerous because they can be expensive. Here's one of the ironies of the times. Because interest rates are so low, investors in the UK have bought UK index-linked gilts because at least you get a return out of them. Now, it's not guaranteed because obviously inflation changes, but in general, it's been higher, and it's distorted the inflation-linked market, which has been like the sort of tail wagging the dog. So there's a lot of different factors in play, but each time you come back to the same problem. If you raise interest rates to even something like 3 or 4%, that's then incredibly expensive. Where's the money going to come from? Therefore, if you apply that logic, they won't do it. So we're back to my song lyrics of us being in something of a trap, or Elvis's song lyrics, excuse me.
Now, I'm curious to get your thoughts, because I've been talking about this for quite some time now. Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve chief, has been talking, or chairman rather, has been talking about the monetary toolkit. There's more than enough tools to make sure that the economy doesn't overheat and all that other, Fed speech they love to throw at us. But yet the reverse repo market, that's something that I'm trying to still better understand myself. Because as I've seen a lot of economists talk about, it's going to be a problem, but yet it's not enough currency. They're trying to draw it out of the system. Can you give us, your take on the reverse repo market, and might this be the pin that pricks the global asset bubbles, you think?
Well, the issue here is this is the opposite of what the normal problem is. We about a year ago, more, maybe 2 years ago, and generally at times running up to Christmas, banks usually run short of US dollars. I don't so much mean US banks. This is quite often international ones, stereotypically Japanese or European ones. But anyway, the point is short of dollars. This time around, because the Federal Reserve has done so much bond buying and other issues, and also the US Treasury has issued the stimulus checks and so many of them, US banks have got loads of money in, but they don't need it. They don't want it. And there's no interest on it. So they're giving it back to the Fed. This is what the reverse repo thing is. Now, last number I saw was about 730 billion in terms of US dollars. And so in itself, it's a big deal. Will it keep just getting larger? The Fed has sort of tried to stop it. I mean, I was saying earlier, it was trying to avoid negative interest rates. That's one of the reasons why it has put an interest rate on it. It's not much, 0.05%. So it's partly symbolic. But it also is so that there is one and a return, but the money is just churning in the system. To put it another way, when the Bank of England started QE, I forget that this was a stage when it had just done over about 300 billion. It actually got back 260 billion of it. So QE is not turned out to be quite as people thought. The money was supposed to go from here to there, and somehow or the other, filter somewhere around the ordinary person. But the truth is it's never really got out the system. And in some respects, just some, the fiscal stimuluses and the checks so far have done the same. As in many cases, people haven't been able to spend them. Now, some of that, of course, is changing because places like Florida and Texas are more open, looking at the US. But some places that's still true. But the banks, ironically, have got too much money.
Now, let me ask you a question. So, if the overall money sloshing around has not been left out of the system, it's been amongst the banks. They've basically been cycling the funds back and forth. And so, in your opinion, is there a threat of the current funds that have been created in form of reserves with the Federal Reserve and the commercial banks doing what they're doing? Is there a chance of it leaking out into the system and really causing that a higher extreme inflation? I hear a lot of people say that there's a threat of hyperinflation if all the current units of account go chasing a small amount of goods. We can run into a extreme hyperinflation type of environment. Is that something you see in the distant future, near future, or what?
I'm not really a hyperinflationist. In fact, I've never been through this thing because you see, even inflation sustained at a rate as the US has just seen, 5%, is very dangerous because it doesn't take very long before the ordinary person, that's very expensive. If we were to go back a decade, the ordinary assumption was, and this is in so many economics models, in spite of the fact it no longer applies, that wages would go up by 2% more. Now, it's been a while since it actually happened, and it was more like 1%, but the principle was wages would go up by more than inflation. But that doesn't happen for many people anymore. And so that's the thing. So I think that the hyperinflation thing is sort of, I'm not quite sure what the analogy is for that there, but people are sort of playing in the wrong field because actually quite small levels are very dangerous. We don't need that to actually get the effects that they're afraid of from the hyperinflation, in my opinion. Because it's all, we've seen through the pandemic, various things whereby things have been okay if you're getting the stimulus checks. But say if you're in a thing that doesn't qualify for it, you're not okay. So there's, again, been another switch between groups in people's circumstances. And this is the problem. If you now get not really a lot of inflation, for those that are struggling, things are going to be very hard. And these conversations are going on in the UK, around Europe, Japan, because they're the same problems. First world countries, of course, there's always been poor and things like that. But if you're used to, in general, not only a nice lifestyle, but assuming it's going to get better, not only for themselves, but for their children. Now, I think that we're facing a situation where that may not be true. And certainly in many places hasn't been in the last decade or so. And so that's the issue. It doesn't take very much to create a problem, a few percent a year. And then in no time, people are much worse off.
Now, what's your thought? So it sounds like in order to get to the extreme points of severe hyper extreme inflation, however you want to call it, there's going to be a deflationary crash. You hinted at earlier the Fed looking to avoid another recession, given the fact they don't have much ammo as far as being able to adjust rates or whatnot. So literally the Fed is fighting a deflationary type of crash, you would say?
Yes, and for those wondering how you can have deflation and inflation at the same time, I see them as differently. Deflation is falling demand. Inflation is rising prices. You can get both. Unfortunately, we've seen both. And that's one of the problems. One of the ironies in the original Greek situation, when the economy collapsed, actually for a while prices were rising before they then fell as well. So in fact, Greece was, everywhere you look at it, a complete disaster. If you actually set out to write an economic disaster, that was Greece. But coming back to the situation now, when we come out of the pandemic, I mean, once, how would you define that? Let's say I know we're nearly there in the UK and to some extent in the US, but virtually everyone who wants to be is vaccinated. So that problem is hopefully mostly gone. And then the economy returns to where it was and starts growing. But how much are we going to grow? And that's been the credit crunch question, really, because with all of these issues, you see, if you get the whole sort of stereotype, we say it grow for 3% a year. If we could get back to that, then these debt problems would soon go away. The problem is they don't. The classic case of this sort of being a building issue has been Italy. Italy's had so little growth. And so actually it hasn't, in terms of deficits, had very much. The trouble is because it hasn't grown, it's kept piling up, the debt, because there's been nothing to set against it. And even though now is that an issue because it can borrow so cheaply in its circumstances, again, but we're back to the same problem. It can't let it get more expensive because it can't afford it. So we're back. The simple situation, the fans of the film 2001 Space Odyssey, when they look at the monolith and they say, you know, something wonderful, well, that would be growth of 3% a year if we could somehow find it and sustain it.
Yeah, now finding it and sustaining it is, I think, realistically, in in a great fairy tale novel, it'd be great to be able to return back to normal in reference to the way things were prior to last March when things were locked down globally. But I think as a part of this World Economic Forum, Great Reset, there's a greater agenda, and I think that's why we're being introduced to central bank digital currencies as well as all types of other things that's thrown out there. What are your thoughts about that? I personally think that, you know, the day of reckoning is upon us now as far as the need for something new. The dollar has ran its course. The debt-based monetary system can no longer be drawn out, this as we're seeing, the fight for growth through debt. But yeah, what are your thoughts? You know, what do you anticipate this next couple of years to look like if this thing isn't resolved and we're ushered into a whole new tire payment networking system and currency directly given through people's cell phones now, using digital and technology advancements? What do you think is going to, how will that better our circumstance or make things worse in your opinion?
Well, you see, these things play out in several forms. If you're looking at someone paying by their smartphone, I had a knee injury and I was going in to see the physio, and the person in front of me was paying with their phone. This was a few years ago. I thought that looks rather impressive. And now, of course, it's everywhere, isn't it? So that's a nice side to it. Through the pandemic, I didn't spend any actual money for ages. So again, nice side of it. But the catch is when the central bank version, why are they doing this? It's so they can impose negative interest rates. This is for next time round. How will they do it? Well, because they can then set a rate of exchange between the digital money and real money. So you give them $100, they give you 97 back. That I've chosen that number specifically because that was the IMF International Monetary Fund example, which I believe they're using as a template. So that would set an interest rate of -3% a year, which would be quite punishing if you look at it like that. You know, this is the reverse example. I'm sure you have a similar system in some form in the US, but in the UK, when someone puts money in a pension, i.e. they're going to say they're going to pay in their own money, then they get given an illustration. Now, the illustration, because I worked in this area for a while, it'd be something like 2% a year, 4% a year, 6% a year. So you end up with more money than you started, hopefully. Now try doing that with -3% a year. I'll put $50,000 in my pension, but I'll get 30,000 back. Well, no. And that's the problem with this. This is, you use the phrase the Great Reset, and there's lots of other things that come in with that. But in terms of interest rates, this is the issue and this is the problem. Now, for those that are watching this and thinking, why are they doing this? This is because they then believe you'll immediately spend your money. Now, actually, in the US and the UK, of the problems we have, that isn't it. If you look at UK retail sales, we spend our money. I don't think the US is that dissimilar. So it doesn't that. I think their line of argument falls down quite quickly, actually. But their theory is that as a collective, there's too much savings in the world. Now, to some extent, they have a point. But of course, the problem is we're back to the thing of the 0.1% or even the 0.0001%, that so much of it is in very few hands. The ordinary person doesn't have that. So they'd be hit hard quite quickly in their, the ordinary manner, spending, living, trying to save for a holiday, short term, or pensions, long term. Normal things that wherever this might be seen around the world, people will be thinking of as best they can. It's a lot harder for them, and you're losing 3% a year. Then how's that going to work? And here's one of the lessons of this age, and I've seen it both individually and collectively. When you do this, if you look at the numbers, people actually want to save more. So there's an almost backwash, if it was a river, against it. But their plan, I believe, in the next recession is to do that. So the headliner, so to speak, would be the European Central Bank, simply because it's already there. It may not actually get out of negative interest rates till there's a paradigm change, because how will it? They've raised interest rates twice. Is it still in the last decade? Actually, it's just out of the last decade, excuse me, because one of them was in 2010. And that's it.
Whew, that's a very scary scenario you just laid out of what they're fighting against and why they have already laid the groundwork for what they want to, I guess, give us as a solution, which is a digital version of a rebranded version of the currencies. Now, the problems are obvious. You laid them out quite well. Now, for your average person who might be concerned, everyone should be. Wealth preservation tools, wealth preservation strategies is what I want to kind of lean towards now, in accordance to what we know is occurring now and what typically historically has been proven to work, as well as any other new opportunities that might present themselves. Share with us a couple things that you perhaps do as an economist, as well as a money investor, that people can investigate more of their time and energy into learning how to do to hopefully protect and preserve themselves for their own financial futures.
Well, you see, one of the problems with this is that so many of these things have gone. Because, for example, I spent most of my career in bonds. You can't really buy a bond and get interest out of it now, can you? You know, and even the rates I quoted earlier, ironically, the US is one of the exceptions. Might not sound it, but 1.3% on the 10-year is quite high these days. The UK, you only get 0.6. Europe, it's negative. If you can find them, I'm a fan of index-linked bonds. The reason why I say if you can find them is that because of the situation, for example, in my home country, the UK, I've been in the past an owner of our index-linked bonds, but they're now so expensive you can't buy them. You could buy them, inflation goes up and you lose money because the price was so high in the first place. And this is back to one of the problems of the QE era. I was saying before that the money sloshed around the system. Well, it has gone into things and pumped up the price. So how can you buy them? In the UK, property is a popular thing, particularly where I live in London. So many foreign investors coming in as well. But now, guess what? It's become almost unaffordable. So unfortunately, I have more questions than answers for you as to where to go with your money. An ex-colleague of mine, we were looking a while back at gold. But of course, gold's fallen back now. Okay, that makes it a better investment going forwards. You know, there was something I've always kind of liked and regret missing out on. Comes from your sort of name, actually, which is silver. I remember reading some years back that silver has an antibiotic effect. That might come into play. You know, we've seen in times of pandemics and things like that, people are desperate for things and will pay any price, won't they? Now, it's not quite an investment strategy because you're sort of hoping for something that you hope won't happen, because obviously it'd have to be really bad for that to be in play. But that could be so. The thing is, I'm not such an expert on the US equity market, but things with a reliable yield for the reasons I've just explained. And if you could get something that could reliably even only pay 3 or 4% a year, I suspect over the next few years, there'll be some point that looks really valuable.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And Shaun, once again, it has been great connecting with you here. Man, you laid out a nice explanation as to what we're facing. And once again, you laid out some things at the very end as to way people could further educate themselves and invest in opportunities that protects, preserves, and offers some type of yield in this world that's heading towards a negative territory. But for those that might be new to Shaun Richards, can you share with us a little bit where they can find out more of what you do? And of course, I'll put some links below, but share with people how to connect with you to find out more of things you do.
Yeah, sure, no problem. I put out quite a bit of output across social media. So not a yes man's economics. That's how you can find me. I come up pretty high on the Google searches, so that should be easy. And on Twitter, I can be found as not a yes man econ.
All right. Well, Shaun, thank you once again for connecting with us on RTD interviews here. So as always, if you guys have enjoyed this, definitely is a wealth of knowledge laid out for you. Hit that thumbs up button and then share this with your family and friends so they can have a chance to learn about what's going on, because these are things you won't hear in mainstream stories and especially mainstream outlets. So once again, Shaun, thank you for joining us on RTD interviews.
Pleasure. Thank you.